I'll be reading Joshua chapter 14, verses 6 to 14. Now the men of Judah approached Joshua of Gilgal and the Caleb the son of Jephunneh the Kenizzite, and said to him, You know what the Lord said to Moses the man of God, of Kadesh Barnea, about you and me. It was 40 years old when Moses the servant of the Lord sent me from Kadesh Barnea to explore the land, and I brought back to him a report according to my convictions. But my brothers who sent up with me made the hearts of the people melt with fear. I, however, followed the Lord my God wholeheartedly. So on that day Moses swore to me, The land on which your feet have walked will be your inheritance and that of your children forever, because you have followed the Lord my God wholeheartedly. Now then, just as the Lord promised, he has kept me alive for 45 years since the time he said this to Moses, while Israel moved about in the desert. So here I am today, 85 years old. I am still as strong as today that Moses sent me out. I am just as vigorous to go out to battle now as I was then. Now give me this hill country that the Lord promised me that day. You yourself have heard that the Anakites were there, and heard their cities large and fortified. But the Lord was helping me. I will drive them out just as he said. Then Joshua blessed Caleb the son of Jephunneh and gave him Hebron as his inheritance, so that Hebron belonged to Caleb the son of Jephunneh and Kenizzite ever since, because he followed the Lord, the God of Israel, wholeheartedly.
You can be seated. Thank you. It's a good job on that reading, Joseph. I know that was a big one with a bunch of long words in it. You did great. It's one of my favorite stories in Scripture. I really enjoy that story about Caleb. I don't remember how old I was, but this was a number of years ago. I remember it was an evening and I was watching television with my parents, and the thing that was on television was a show dedicated to celebrating Bob Hope's 85th birthday. He was turning 85, and one of the people who was there at that special to honor him was George Burns. A lot of you remember George Burns because he was around for a really long time. You know, he was known for living, I think he lived to be 100, and he often used a lot of humor based on the fact that he was so old over time. But one of the things I can remember as a kid that he said when he got up to make his comments, he started off and said, I just want to congratulate Bob on reaching his 85th birthday. He said, 85. You know, I can remember falling off my skateboard when I was 85. When you think about Caleb, you think of this youthfulness that he had even into his older years. I love all the details provided in that text that Joseph read for us. Yeah, I can remember it was 45 years ago when all these things started happening, and God has kept me alive. But Caleb was one of two people, just him and Joshua, who could even remember, who had actually been adults in slavery in Egypt. They could remember what it was like to be slaves. They could remember what it was like being set free from slavery. Caleb is one of those people who could remember and tell you about the miracles, the parting of the Red Sea, all the events that happened at Sinai, the giving of the law. He could describe for you what the golden calf looked like, exactly how it was shaped, and he could probably show you with his hand about how big it was. This is a guy who had seen so many things. What I love about him is his vigor, his continuing willingness to step up. 85 years old, and he says, you know, I'm basically just as strong as the day we came out of Egypt. And his request was, give me this mountain. Give me this hill country. I know that if I follow the Lord wholeheartedly, just like I always have, if I follow the Lord wholeheartedly, he'll give me the things that he's promised. Let me go and take this mountain. I appreciate also the way that Caleb is thinking, because he's not just doing something that was for his own benefit. At 85 years old, going into a major area of battle, conquering fortified cities, this is not something, the blessing of which he'd have many years left to enjoy. But he was willing to step up and do the difficult thing. He was willing to do the hard thing so that future generations could be blessed by his faithfulness. He said, if I follow the Lord wholeheartedly, I know that God is going to do big things through me. Galatians chapter 6 and verse 9 says, let us not become weary in doing good, for at the proper time we will reap a harvest if we do not give up. As a congregation, we don't yet have 85 years of history, but we do have about 60 years of history. I think we have to look as a congregation at Caleb's example and his vigor and his courage. And we don't want to be a church that sets back and says, well, you know, we've had 60 good years and that was a pretty good run for us. But now it's time to sit back and take it easy. Not at all. Caleb was still a guy who 85 years into his life was saying, Lord, I'm ready to go and conquer that mountain. We need to be a church who keeps thinking forward. We keep advancing, not retreating, not sitting down, but saying, like Caleb said, we believe wholeheartedly that if we follow God and we open ourselves up to God, that God can continue to do big things through us. I wanted to look at the logo again for this common ground theme that we've been talking about. We're going to spend several weeks kind of fleshing out some of the ideas related to this as we are trying to enter this period of spiritual growth as a congregation, really thinking about what it is that God wants to do through us. Last week, we did something that was a little bit more conceptual. I talked about God's heart. We talked about the way that God loves us so dearly, even fully knowing everything. God's omniscient. He knows everything that can be known. And even knowing all of our shortcomings and all of our sins and all of our rebellion, God is still just as pleased as He could be to use us, to work through us, to bless us, to give us new life and new opportunities. We talked about God's heart last week. This week, I want to talk on this idea of our hands. What is it that God could be doing through us? We want to grow in our knowledge of the love of God and become like God, but what does that actually look like if God starts doing more things through us? We are committed as a church to really making a sincere effort at growing. We want to have some new ministries that we haven't done before. We want to start new things. We want to do more things. We want to make a larger impact as a church, perhaps than the impact we've already made as a church. And our vision is big enough that if it were to come to pass, it's actually going to take more people to accomplish it than just the people we have right now. We want to grow in our vision so that God can help us with these things. But if we actually intend to grow, if we intend that there would be more people here working with us and helping us, what will that actually look like? So what I'm going to do in my sermon time today, this is going to be, I think, unlike any other sermon I've done, but I want to do some thinking this morning about some nuts and bolts. You know, we talked last week a little bit more about grand vision. This week I want to talk more about specifics. If we're serious about growing and adding people, what is it going to have to be like around here for that to work and for that to happen? So a few years ago, the elders put forth this Vision 2020. And we had some core values. They spent a lot of time praying, looking at scriptures, and these were 4 things they came up with, whereas we think about what it is that God is moving us towards and wants us to be doing, here are some values that we want to have. We've shared these several times. We want to be a church who stays focused on Jesus. We want to continue being a diverse congregation who really values the diverse members and households of our congregation. We want to be growing as a church in our mission mindset. We really want to be thinking about reaching unchurched people. We want to be reaching the lost. We want to be helping people find their way towards Jesus and doing that as being part of our congregation. And we also want to be building a foundation for the church of tomorrow. So those were kind of the big values that we started thinking about. We also began trying to imagine, we're not able to predict the future. We don't know for sure, but what would it look like if we really took those things seriously? From that thinking, that's what led us to the next 4 points that we've been talking about some. If we were serious about growing in those ways, we would like to see our attendance double to 600 or more people. We envision that God could help us to do that. We want to make sure that we do have thriving ministries for all ages, not just for a few select groups, but for all ages, making sure our ministries are active and thriving. We want the experience of worshiping here to be something that is relevant to your life and that is dynamic and inspiring as you come and attend here. And then we also want to make sure that if we're serious about adding more people, we have facilities that could accommodate more people, if we took that goal seriously. So what would it take for us to grow? If we were to start adding a bunch of more people, if we wanted 600 people to start worshiping here each week, what are some things that would have to be different? I'm going to use an analogy of a bathtub. There's some things I don't like about the bathtub analogy because I don't like the thought of the water kind of sitting still in the tub. It might be better to think about a jacuzzi when you think about the church. We want to have people that are moving and active and warm and those kinds of things. But part of what we're talking about is how do you get more people to stay put if we were to use that bathtub analogy? If you're thinking about filling a bathtub, one component of how you fill the bathtub is the faucet, right? There's the faucet that you've got to turn on to increase the flow of water. In terms of churches, we'd be talking about how do we get people to show up here. And I'd have to say, of the different components, this is one thing that lately for us has been working pretty well. It is pretty normal for us on a Sunday morning that 10% of the people here are visitors. We have a large number of people who are showing up and checking us out and thinking about what it is that we're doing here. So how is it that people do find us? Far and above anything else, the most important way that this happens is through your efforts. When you reach out to someone you know who's not going to church anywhere and you invite them to come with you and you invite them to sit with you, or you're participating in some ministry that reaches out to people, I mean, you, the church, we, the church, it's the things you do individually that are more important than anything else we could do that's flashy or commercials or advertisements or any of those things. Not that those don't matter, but it's your efforts first and foremost that really bring people in. A couple of other things we have done recently. We, as a church in the last year, we added a better sign on the road that thousands of people see and drive past all the time. Les has taken on the role of keeping that updated from week to week. That has gotten us a lot better visibility that people notice us as they drive by. Another thing that we've also done recently is that we got our new website launched. It took me working with a web designer about a year to get that thing done, but I'm actually really happy with how it turned out. And I've already talked to several people who decided to visit us when they saw that we had a really nice looking website. So they assume, when you see something that looks like quality, you assume it's going to be a quality place. So it's good that we spent a little money on that and put some effort into making that happen. The fun part for me now is I can watch how it is that people arrive at our website. The biggest driving thing to our website is actually Rainbow Express. Our preschool program is outstanding. Lots of people are looking for that. The last couple of weeks, we've seen lots of people coming to our website looking for Kindness Blitz. That's been another thing that's been fun as you've been making those efforts. But we have the ability to watch and see what it is that people are looking for when they come to us. So there's some things we can do that kind of turn the faucet on. But the other issue we've got to think about is the drain. How is it that we lose people in a church setting? Now, a couple of these ways are totally out of our control. Truthfully, sometimes people do pass away. People die, and when they die, they don't get to come here anymore. Hopefully, they've gone to a much better place, but they're not here among us working anymore. But death is a significant source of loss for us a lot of the time. Another thing that we've seen happen a lot recently is that people end up moving away. This happens with a lot of our younger families as they get new jobs and have to take new jobs in other places. It's been happening with a lot of our older members where, maybe they're getting a little bit older, they need to be with family, and so they relocate where they can have someone help to take care of them. Those are both natural things that do happen. And in fact, something that a lot of people don't think about, in order to maintain the size that we actually have to add a lot of new people just to stay the same because of how many people pass away or move away. So the fact that we've maintained what we have for a number of years is really something we should be proud of. It is actually hard to add enough people to a church even to continue being what you are. But there's another source of drain that we have to be more careful about, and this is the idea of people who simply don't get plugged in. People who come here for a while and maybe they sit here and they worship with us for a while, but they don't really plug into a class, they don't plug into a ministry, they don't make many friends, and then very quietly they just stop attending and start attending somewhere else. And those are the ones a lot of times that we don't notice. Now, I will say we've been making a concerted effort to plug that drain through this new member integration luncheon thing that we did a few weeks ago. We just did the first of those. Those will start being a regular thing that we do. But if a person wants to check out King's Crossing, we want to make it really easy for them to find their way in. Who are the people who lead things? What are the ministries that we have? How does a person get involved? Who do you talk to about things that you're needing? That's something that we want to be real deliberate about. And in fact, the larger a church is, the clearer it needs to become how a person finds a path to involvement. But that's the aspect that we do have the most control over. Are we making sure that we're really engaging people who show up so when they come, they do get plugged in? Now, people who are experts in church growth will talk about certain ceilings that congregations encounter as they grow. And in fact, in some ways, our church is unique, but there are a lot of ways that all churches have a lot of things in common. And one of the things that seems to be pretty consistent across all churches and all denominations are some dynamics of what's involved in different sizes, different sized groups of people. One of the hardest ceilings to break is what they call the 200 ceiling. This usually means that a congregation has started adding enough people to where they've had one minister on staff and he's trying to kind of do everything for everyone. At some point, a church has to recognize the limits of one person and they start adding additional staff members. It's actually very difficult for a lot of churches to get comfortable with doing that. That 200 ceiling is a hard ceiling. The good news is we broke that ceiling a long time ago and have stayed above that for quite some time. So we're past that one. It's the second ceiling that has provided us with a more significant challenge. They say the hardest ceiling to break in church growth is one that they call the 400 ceiling. It's pretty easy once you've gotten past 200 to maintain being a church of, say, 300 to 400. But to start having a church structure, a church culture that will let us have more than 400 people here actively plugged in and doing things is one that's very difficult to break. I wanted to show you some statistics. I had my theory when I was coming down here that maybe we were one of these churches who's battled with that 400 ceiling. And a few weeks after I got here, Buck sent me some data that absolutely bears that point out. Now, first of all, I don't want you to misread this graph. It does not start at 0, so we didn't accidentally die in 2010 or something. So what you're really looking at is about a swing of about 25%. The very bottom of this graph is 325 people. We've always been very solidly within 300 to 400. But you can see over the decades, starting in 1970, we'll kind of get there, and then something happens, and we kind of dip back down. And we kind of get there again, but for some reason, people are not plugging in well enough. Things are not happening, and then, again, we kind of keep dipping back down. So thinking about this 400 ceiling, and how we get past it, it's helpful to talk a little bit about the dynamics of different sized churches. Incidentally, I'm going to just share a few concepts. If this is something that you're interested in, I've got some really good information in a PDF that's about 12, 14 pages long. I'd be happy to send you that I find really helpful in learning about these things, thinking about these things. I want to talk a little bit about the differences between small churches and large churches. My first ministry job was in a really small congregation of about 60 people. I grew up in a church of about 900 people. So this is stuff that research has bared out, but at the same time, these are some of my personal experiences as well. When you think about a small congregation, most people would think of their place of belonging being the whole congregation. So I know the little country church I preached at in Rosebud, Arkansas, it really was the case that pretty much everybody knew everybody. They shared in their lives together. A lot of them were related to each other. It's pretty common that all of them would know everyone. Blake, could you go to that next slide? There you go. So the whole church is kind of the place of belonging. But at a really large church, it isn't possible to know everybody. We're kind of a medium-sized church, but I think already I could tell you, some of y'all on that side, if you were to go sit over on this side one Sunday, you'd meet a lot of really interesting people you probably haven't met before. And I could say the same thing to you guys on this side. If y'all were to sometime try sitting over there, there's some really great Christian people you've probably never met before. And both of you probably never met all this congregation that sits in the middle, right? We've got a lot of great people here in the middle too. But already at our size, we start experiencing this where it's not possible to know everyone. And so the central place where people find their belonging is either in a Bible class, some kind of life group, a team that they're serving on, or a ministry that they're involved in. So in order to get bigger, you actually have to get smaller. There have to be a lot of smaller options where people can plug in and find places to belong. When you think about their areas of strength, the thing that small churches are really good at are relationships. They're really good at relationships. In fact, I can tell you from my own experience, they'll put up with really mediocre preaching if they like you pretty well. It's those relationships that matter the most, that people know each other. Whether or not worship is perfect, it's okay. You got some flaws. It can be sloppy because in the end, we're all close to each other in a small congregation. But people would put up with a larger congregation and some of the difficulties of not knowing everyone because in a large church, the assumption is that things are going to be done up to the highest possible standard. Quality is really important. And because you don't know everyone, the mission of a church becomes very important. Since I don't know all these people, but I know what we're all moving towards, we can still work together and function as a unit. So for larger churches, things that have to become more important are quality and mission. Thinking about diversity. Small churches, a lot of times, just have a lot in common. People are very similar. Larger churches, there is a much higher amount of diversity. People have a lot of different kinds of talents and interests, and you just can't assume uniformity in the way that things are. Another thing that changes as you move from a small congregation into a larger congregation would also be the role of the leaders. A lot of times in a very small church, the preaching minister kind of does everything, especially if they don't have elders. You know, you preach the sermons, you make the bulletins, you do all the pastoral care, you make all the hospital visits, you're in charge of evangelism, you're in charge sometimes of cutting the grass, you're in charge of, anything that goes on. A lot of times it comes down to one person being highly involved in everyone's lives. But as a church gets much larger, it becomes important that the leaders don't make themselves into bottlenecks, but instead focus more on the vision and on the teaching. Again, tying into the quality of things being done. So thinking about King's Crossing and what we are, right now we would be categorized by church growth statisticians as a medium-sized church who's trying to become a larger church. And I think if you look at those qualities I was just talking about, it would be accurate to say that we have qualities of both of those. One of the things I'm proud of you guys for doing, I consistently have visitors talk to me about how friendly our church is. Even though we've gotten to be a larger church, I watch several of you make an effort every Sunday as you move about the pews looking for people that you can say hi to. I really appreciate you doing that, because as we get larger, that's something that easily goes away. We want to strive to maintain that sense of intimacy and smallness and valuing each person, but at the same time, there's some other aspects we've got to be thinking about. So, a lot of times, the biggest difficulty for a medium-sized church to become a larger church, I'm going to give you two keys we've really got to be thinking about as a congregation moving forward. The first key we've got to be thinking about is quality. Usually the single biggest barrier for a medium-sized church trying to get above the 400 level and to stay above the 400 level is that we have to start insisting on higher quality in everything that we do, that we really do want to do all of our ministries, our worship, everything we're involved in with a sense of committedness and with personal excellence. Quality becomes very important. In a small church, because everything's really just about the friendships, people don't really care if stuff is kind of sloppy or not that informative or not that well thrown together, because in the end, we're just here because we love God, but then secondly, we're really close to each other. But as a congregation gets larger and you're not going to know everyone, the quality is one of the things that hangs on to people. We have to work on becoming increasingly excellent in our communication. One of the things I've appreciated, Patricia started working in our office staff, and if you haven't been looking at your email blasts, she gave those things a real major facelift. They're looking really good. She's worked very hard on that communication. Communication has to be more redundant in a church like ours. Some things that we announce, I know some of you have heard them 4 or 5 times, but it's really hard to make sure that everybody hears everything that's going on and knows about everything that's going on. Communication is really important. The quality of our worship. We really appreciate all the people who are putting effort into being prepared to help lead our worship, being ready to go when it's your turn to serve, the way people have been practicing some of our songs to help us sing them with better excellence. These are all things that are very important. And of course, I guess one of the elephants in the room is also the quality of my teaching needs to be very good, as well as all the other teachers. Half of what we do when we worship is listen to me talk. I really need to work hard in making sure I'm providing you with a good quality of content, things that inspire you to live better, and very much would invite you to always be praying for me in that regard. I really do want God to use me in that way, but that's something that also takes work. We talked a little bit already about assimilation. It needs to be very clear how a person finds us and then also gets involved. So one key for us as we continue to move forward and think about how could we have 600 or more people here, we've got to be thinking about all aspects of what we do. How do we increase the quality of these things? The second thing we've got to be doing is empowering groups. For a larger size congregation, the primary place of belonging, again, is going to be a Bible class, a ministry you're involved in, a life group, a team, something somewhere that's a smaller group that you plug into. So we've got to be very deliberate about creating these and making opportunities for people. I want to say to our elders' credit, this is something that they've also taken very seriously as an eldership. At a church our size, what tends to happen with elderships is that if all decisions have to go through them, they become bottlenecks. No innovation happens, very little gets done, and they very easily become bottlenecks for what's happening instead of enablers of what should be happening. I'll say to their credit, a couple of years ago we brought in Carlos Gupton. Y'all got to hear him as a guest speaker on a Sunday morning, and he did a fantastic job, but what he did with our elders on Saturday was a 7-hour workshop on how they could grow in becoming more empowering as leaders. And some of the fruits we've been seeing from that would be this Common Ground campaign for one, but we've been forming a number of teams, a number of groups, and the elders have been trying to empower more and more people to take ownership in the well-being of our church. Because it's in these smaller groups and teams that innovation and new thinking start happening. I would also just mention for your reference, if you're not currently plugged in here somewhere and you say, well, I think I might like to get on one of these teams. An encouraging statistic, by the way, we just got several of these Common Ground teams going. We've already got 86 people who've committed to serving on these teams. So that stat people say about like 10% of the people doing 90% of the work, that's not true for us. We have a lot of people who are stepping up in a lot of different ways to serve here. But one of the ways that you can find a group to plug into, if you look at our website, there's a section at the top, there's a tab called Start Here, and there's a series of blue buttons. And under those blue buttons, you can find one that says Serve. And if you click on Serve and click on Ministry Teams, they've all got an online presence where you're perfectly able and capable of joining with any Bible class, life group, Bible study, prayer group. We've got a lot of those represented there that you can plug into. Just wanted to make sure you're aware of those. Tim Keller says, and I think this is an important quote, he says, when you have more quality options, more people will opt. When there are more things for people to plug into, more people will tend to plug into things. When you think about a church of 200 and say, well, you want to grow from a church of 200 to a church of 400, you might assume that a church of 400 needs to have double the number of ministries and classes that a church of 200 does. But actually, the statistics are it needs to be more like 4 or 5 times as many. As the church gets more diverse, so do the needs for new things. I wanted to talk a little bit about our facilities and part of our reasoning for why we've been talking about this campaign. Blake, if we go to that next slide, this is our current building arrangement. The intent was that these rooms on the left side of the building could have the divider walls put up so that we would have a number of adult classrooms. Those were good intentions. The reality of how this works out is that we really need those walls down pretty much all the time. Between dinners, funeral meals, 49er events, faith builder events, youth group events, we pretty much, anytime I have tried dividing up an area, someone within 2 days comes and tells me I have to take those walls back down because it's needed for something else. So it's a blessing to be a little overcrowded, but if you look at the number of adult classroom spaces we have, a church of about 300 to 350 realistically needs between 5 to 6 adult Bible classes to get people plugged in. But what we have right now, we have the teens in one space, and we've really only got 4 other spaces. So right now, if I wanted to launch another Christianity 101 class for newcomers, if we wanted to do another Financial Peace University, if we wanted to start up an extra ladies Bible class option, right now we don't have anywhere we can do any of those things. So going to the next slide, part of what we've been looking at with this new facility is that the teens would have a dedicated space where they could be, and once the teens are there, and we have a bigger fellowship space where we can do a lot of different kinds of ministry, certainly including fellowships and gatherings. What this actually does is it opens up these other parts of our building and makes them more useful. So in going to that change, instead of us having only 4 spots for adult Bible classes, functionally we would then have 8. So it really does open up a lot of possibilities for us. And as we're thinking about the needs for getting smaller in order to get larger, that is something we would perceive as a need that would help with. Incidentally, as we're moving that direction, one of the teams that we're going to be forming is specifically a team to focus on what some of the new ministries are that we're going to be doing as we add additional space. What are some of the things we're going to do? We don't want to just build a building and assume people will show up. We want to be deliberate in creating new spaces, new opportunities for people to plug in and get involved. I had a friend who shared a quote with me that I thought was really helpful. He says, excellence honors God and inspires people. You look at the way that Caleb insisted on being a person of excellence, of doing big things to the best of his ability. I think of Paul's quote in 1 Corinthians 12 where he talks about, I'll show you a more excellent way. Excellence honors God and inspires people. And I know today this has been a sermon where we've talked about a lot of nuts and bolts, and I don't do this stuff all the time, so I appreciate you accommodating me as we think about some of these things moving forward. But I would invite all of us to be thinking about ourselves individually. In my life, what is it I'm doing for God? And if I were to take a march towards excellence, if I were to try to do everything I'm doing in a slightly more excellent way than I have been, what for you would be one step you could take moving towards excellence? doing a little bit more, doing things a little bit better, showing a little more dedication in your commitment to God. If there are any special needs we have this morning, this is an opportunity we've set aside where you can respond if you need to, and we're happy to help you any way that we can, but we would invite you to come forward as together we stand and sing.